A humble woodcutter saved the life of a rich young girl who was drowning in a river. When he returned home, a surprise awaited him. He immediately called the police, and a chain of shocking events ensued. The sun began its descent, casting an amber glow across the horizon as Jonathan, the humble woodcutter, stood on the bank of the raging river. His axe, worn from years of toil, rested on the ground nearby. He had come to collect firewood for the village but was startled by a piercing cry for help. His sharp eyes scanned the river's surface, where he spotted a figure struggling against the merciless current. Without hesitation, Jonathan leaped into the icy water. His powerful arms fought the current as he swam toward the drowning girl. Her pale face bobbed above the water, her wide eyes filled with terror. "Hold on," he bellowed, his voice strong yet comforting. Reaching her just in time, Jonathan wrapped one arm around her waist and began the arduous swim back to shore. The river fought him with every stroke, but his determination was unyielding. At last, his feet touched solid ground, and he dragged the girl onto the riverbank. The girl coughed violently, expelling water from her lungs. Jonathan crouched beside her, his hands shaking from the cold. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. The girl nodded weakly, her damp golden hair sticking to her face. She was no older than 16, wearing a dress that once spoke of wealth but now clung to her frame, sodden and tattered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. I thought I was going to die." Jonathan nodded. "You're safe now. Where's your family?" The girl hesitated, her expression shifting between fear and confusion. I ran away from the estate. I didn't mean to." Before she could finish, the sound of distant voices and barking dogs reached them. A group of people emerged from the trees, searching for her, no doubt. Among them was a man in a tailored suit, his stern expression softening with relief as his eyes fell upon the girl. "Emily," he called, rushing forward. The girl's face drained of color. "It's my father's assistant. Please, don't let him take me." Jonathan hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before he could decide, the assistant reached them, flanked by two men in security uniforms. "Emily, thank heavens you're safe," the assistant said, pulling her to her feet. Jonathan stepped back, his instincts urging him not to interfere further. Yet, something about the assistant's demeanor unsettled him. "You saved her," the assistant said, turning to Jonathan. "Her father will want to reward you. Please, come with us to the estate." Jonathan hesitated again, then nodded. Perhaps it would be best to see this through. He followed the group through the woods, his thoughts racing. By the time they arrived at the grand estate, the sky was painted in hues of purple and navy. The mansion loomed before Jonathan, its opulence stark against his modest existence. He felt out of place, a simple man among the trappings of immense wealth. Inside, the girl's father, a wealthy industrialist named Charles Whitmore, paced the marble foyer. When he saw his daughter, his expression turned to one of overwhelming relief. "Emily," he exclaimed, rushing to embrace her. "What happened? Why did you leave?" Emily's eyes welled with tears, but she said nothing. Instead, she glanced at Jonathan, a silent plea for him not to speak of what she had said by the river. Charles turned to Jonathan. "You saved my daughter's life. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same. I insist you stay for dinner." "Please, it's the least we can do," Charles said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jonathan reluctantly agreed. During dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Emily barely touched her food, her eyes darting nervously between her father and the assistant. The latter seemed to notice and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that made her flinch. When dinner concluded, Charles pressed a hefty envelope into Jonathan's hands. "A token of my gratitude," he said. "And if there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask." Jonathan thanked him and departed, feeling both uneasy and overwhelmed. The envelope, when opened, revealed a sum of money far greater than anything he'd ever held. As Jonathan stepped into his humble cabin later that night, he sighed with relief, happy to be home. But the moment he lit the lantern, he froze. The interior of his home was in disarray. Chairs overturned, his tools scattered across the floor. A sense of violation surged through him. His axe lay where he had left it by the door, untouched. Whoever had done this had not been seeking his possessions. They had been searching for something specific. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He spotted a piece of paper pinned to the wall with a knife. Trembling, he approached and read the note. "Stay out of it." His breath caught. Out of what? He looked around the cabin again, his mind racing. A cold dread settled over him. Someone was warning him or threatening him. Reaching for his phone, Jonathan dialed the local police. He didn't know what he had stumbled into, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The crackling of the old wood-burning stove was the only sound in Jonathan's cabin as he sat in his small kitchen, staring at the ominous note pinned to his wall. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him. The girl he had saved, her strange fear of her father's assistant, and now this warning. Who had been in his cabin? Why were they trying to intimidate him? Jonathan wasn't the type to meddle in other people's affairs, but now it seemed as though trouble had found him anyway. The sound of approaching car tires on gravel jolted him from his thoughts. His cabin, nestled in the woods on the outskirts of town, rarely received visitors, especially at night. He rose cautiously, his hand instinctively going for the axe by the door. A sleek black car pulled up outside. The headlights dimmed, and a figure stepped out. Jonathan squinted, recognizing the silhouette of Charles Whitmore's assistant, Mr. Hathaway. The man's tailored suit looked out of place in the rugged setting. Jonathan opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock in place. "It's late. What do you want?" Mr. Hathaway's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I came to thank you again for saving Emily." Mr. Whitmore insisted I deliver another token of gratitude. Jonathan didn't move. "I've already been thanked. If that's all, good night." Hathaway's lips twitched in a half-smile. "I also wanted to ensure you're aware of how important it is to leave the Whitmore family matters alone." Jonathan's grip tightened on the door. "What's that supposed to mean?" The assistant's smile disappeared. "It means you don't ask questions. Emily's well-being is being taken care of. Your part is over." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "If you're trying to intimidate me, you're wasting your time. Consider it friendly advice." Hathaway glanced past Jonathan, his eyes sweeping the interior of the cabin. "Good night, Mr. Blake." With that, Hathaway returned to the car and drove off into the night, leaving Jonathan standing in the doorway, his thoughts spinning. The warning was no longer implied, it was explicit. Something was happening within the Whitmore family, something sinister. The next morning, Jonathan visited the local police station. Detective Erica Malone, a sharp, no-nonsense officer he'd dealt with before, listened attentively as he recounted the events of the previous night. "You're saying someone broke into your home, left a threatening note, and then this assistant shows up to warn you?" she asked, her brow furrowed. Jonathan nodded. "And the girl, Emily, she seemed scared of him. She didn't want to go back to the estate." Malone leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her notepad. "The Whitmores are powerful people. If you're suggesting something criminal, it won't be easy to prove. Do you have any evidence?" Jonathan hesitated. "No, just a gut feeling and that note." She nodded slowly. "I'll file a report about the break-in. As for the Whitmores, I'll keep an eye on things, but you should be careful. If there's more to this, you might be stepping into dangerous territory." Jonathan left the station feeling a mix of relief and unease. The police were aware of the situation now, but that didn't mean he was safe. That afternoon, Jonathan decided to visit the riverbank where he had saved Emily, hoping to piece together what had happened before he arrived. As he approached, he noticed the imprint of tires in the muddy ground near the water's edge, partially obscured by fresh tracks. Someone had been there since the day before. Scanning the area, Jonathan's eyes landed on something shiny lodged in the underbrush. Pulling it free, he found a bracelet, a delicate gold chain with a small charm shaped like a bird. It didn't look like something Emily would have worn during her escape, but it could belong to someone connected to her. He slipped it into his pocket. Just as he turned to leave, the sound of snapping twigs made him freeze. He spun around, his eyes narrowing as a shadowy figure emerged from the trees. "Lost, are we?" the man said, his voice dripping with mockery. He was tall, with a scar running down his cheek and a dangerous glint in his eye. "Not at all," Jonathan replied calmly, though his pulse quickened. "Just out for a walk." The man's smirk widened. "Funny place for a stroll. Best you turn around and head home. Don't want any accidents happening out here." Jonathan squared his shoulders. "Thanks for the concern, but I'm fine." The man's smile faded. "You've been asking too many questions, Woodcutter. This is your last warning. Stay out of it." Before Jonathan could respond, the man disappeared back into the trees. Jonathan's hand instinctively went to the bracelet in his pocket. Whatever was going on, he wasn't about to back down. That evening, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table, the bracelet lying before him as he mulled over his next move. He needed to know more about Emily's situation and why someone was so desperate to keep him quiet. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. To his surprise, it was Emily. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the doorframe. "I had to come," she whispered. "I didn't know who else to trust." Jonathan let her inside, shutting the door behind her. "What's going on, Emily? Why are they after me?" She sank into a chair, her eyes welling with tears. "They're after you because you saved me. And because I know too much." "Know too much about what?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father, his businesses aren't all legitimate. There are people, dangerous people, who don't want the truth coming out. Hathaway works for them, not my father. He's using my family for his own gain." Jonathan leaned forward. "And what does that have to do with you running away?" Emily's voice cracked. "I overheard a conversation. They're planning to get rid of my father and take over his businesses. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran." Jonathan sat back, the pieces clicking into place. The assistant, the threats, the break-in, they were all connected. But before he could say anything, the cabin was flooded with light from an approaching vehicle. Emily's eyes widened in terror. "They found me." Jonathan grabbed his axe, his jaw tightening. "Stay here." The headlights outside Jonathan's cabin cast long, eerie shadows across the walls. Emily crouched behind the kitchen table, her breathing shallow and frantic. Jonathan stood by the door, his axe gripped tightly in his calloused hands. Whoever was out there had come for her, and maybe for him too. The car engine went silent, leaving the forest blanketed in an unnerving quiet. Then came the crunch of boots on gravel. Jonathan's heart raced as a heavy knock pounded on the door. "Open up, Mr. Blake," a voice called, cold and authoritative. "We know she's in there." Emily's gasp from behind him confirmed his worst fear. They had found her. Jonathan steadied himself, his muscles tense. "Who's asking?" he called back. A pause. "I think you know who we are. This doesn't have to get messy. Hand over the girl, and we'll leave you in peace." Jonathan set his jaw, his voice calm but firm. "You're not taking her." The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then came the sound of a gun being cocked. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Jonathan glanced back at Emily. Her tear-streaked face was filled with terror, but there was also a flicker of determination. "There's a back door," she whispered. "I can run." "No," Jonathan interrupted, his voice firm. "They'll expect that. Stay low." Without warning, the front door burst open, and two men stormed in, guns drawn. Jonathan reacted instinctively, swinging his axe in a wide arc. The blade connected with the nearest man's arm, and he let out a howl of pain, dropping his weapon. The second man lunged forward, his pistol aimed at Jonathan's chest. Before he could pull the trigger, Emily sprang from her hiding place and smashed a cast-iron skillet against the man's head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. "Run!" Jonathan barked, grabbing Emily's hand and pulling her toward the back door. The two of them bolted into the dense woods, the shouts of their attackers echoing behind them. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the cabin behind them. Jonathan's mind raced as they dodged low-hanging branches and stumbled over roots. "Where are we going?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "There's an old hunting shack deeper in the woods," Jonathan replied. His breath labored. "They won't find us there." By the time they reached the shack, both were drenched in sweat and breathing hard. Jonathan pushed open the creaky door, revealing a dusty interior with sparse furnishings. A rickety table, 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner. "It's not much, but it'll keep us hidden for the night," Jonathan said, barring the door behind them. Emily sank onto the cot, clutching her arms. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I never should have involved you." Jonathan crouched in front of her, his expression serious. "You didn't involve me. I made a choice to help you, and I'd do it again. But now you need to tell me everything. If we're going to stop them, I need to know what we're up against." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Hathaway has been working with a group of men who launder money through my father's businesses. They've been stealing millions, but my father didn't know, at least not at first. When he started asking questions, they threatened him." Jonathan frowned. "Why hasn't your father gone to the police?" "Because they control him now. They told him if he doesn't cooperate, they'll come after me." Her voice broke. "That's why I ran. I thought if I disappeared, they'd leave him alone." Jonathan's grip tightened on the axe. "And Hathaway? Where does he fit in?" "He's the one pulling the strings. He's been using my father's influence to expand their operations. If my father steps out of line, Hathaway's ready to take over." Jonathan's mind churned. Hathaway wasn't just an assistant. He was the ringleader of an organized crime operation. The threats, the break-in, the attack tonight, it was all about silencing Emily before she could expose them. The next morning, Jonathan stepped outside the shack, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The air was crisp and still, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural. He knew it wouldn't be long before Hathaway's men found them. Inside, Emily sat at the table, clutching a steaming mug of coffee Jonathan had made from his meager supplies. Her eyes were puffy from lack of sleep, but there was a steely resolve in her expression. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice steady. "They'll just keep coming." Jonathan nodded. "You're right. We need to go on the offensive. If we can get proof of what Hathaway's doing, the police can take him down." Emily's eyes widened. "There's a file in my father's office, a ledger with all their transactions. Hathaway doesn't know I found it. If we can get to it—" Jonathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's risky. If we get caught—" "It's the only way," Emily insisted. "Without that file, they'll keep coming after us. And my father will never be free." Jonathan nodded slowly. "All right, we'll go tonight." As darkness fell, Jonathan and Emily approached the Whitmore estate. The sprawling mansion loomed in the distance, its windows glowing like eyes in the night. The security was tighter than usual, with guards patrolling the perimeter. Jonathan surveyed the scene, formulating a plan. "We'll go around the back. There's a service entrance that's less guarded." Emily nodded, following his lead as they crept through the shadows. The service entrance was unlocked, and they slipped inside undetected. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound their soft footsteps on the marble floors. "This way," Emily whispered, leading him toward her father's office. When they reached the heavy oak door, Emily paused, her hand on the knob. "If we get separated, take the file and run." Jonathan nodded. "We'll get through this." She pushed the door open, and the two of them slipped inside. The office was spacious, lined with bookshelves and a massive mahogany desk. Emily went straight to a hidden compartment in the wall, pulling it open to reveal a leather-bound ledger. "I've got it," she whispered, clutching the file. Before they could move, the door slammed open, and Hathaway strode in, flanked by 2 armed men. His cold smile sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. "Well, well," Hathaway said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I knew you'd come back, Emily, and you brought the woodcutter. How quaint." Jonathan stepped in front of Emily, his axe raised. "Let her go," Hathaway chuckled. "Oh, I don't think so. You've caused enough trouble already. Hand over the ledger and maybe I'll make this quick." Emily's grip on the file tightened. "You'll never get away with this." Hathaway's smile widened. "You think anyone will believe a scared little girl and a nobody like him? You've already lost." Jonathan's knuckles whitened around the axe handle. "We'll see about that." The room erupted into chaos. The room was a battlefield. Hathaway's cold, calculating gaze darted between Jonathan and Emily as his men lay groaning or unconscious on the floor. Jonathan stood firm, his axe at the ready, while Emily clutched the ledger against her chest, her knuckles white. "You're making a mistake," Hathaway said, his voice calm but edged with malice. "You think you're protecting her, but you're just sealing your own fate. You're not laying a hand on her," Jonathan growled, his body tense as he anticipated the next move. Hathaway's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think this is over? You think the police will protect you? They can't touch the people I work for." The chilling implication hung in the air. Jonathan's mind raced. He couldn't let Emily fall into Hathaway's grasp, and he couldn't ignore the gravity of the evidence she held. "Run, Emily," Jonathan said, his voice low and steady. "Take the ledger and get out of here." Emily's eyes widened in panic. "I won't leave you." "Do as I say," he snapped, his gaze still locked on Hathaway. Before she could protest further, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The sound of hurried footsteps and shouts echoed through the mansion. Hathaway's men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering. The door burst open, and Detective Erica Malone stormed in, her gun drawn. "Police! Drop your weapons and step away." Relief flooded Jonathan as Malone's officers filed into the room, their weapons trained on Hathaway and his men. The balance of power shifted instantly. Hathaway's smug demeanor cracked for the first time. "Detective Malone," Hathaway said, his voice a mockery of politeness. "You're interfering in private business." Malone didn't flinch. Private business? Laundering millions of dollars and threatening innocent lives isn't exactly private. "We have enough on you to lock you away for life. Now get on the ground." Hathaway's smirk returned, colder than before. "You don't know who you're dealing with, detective. Arrest me, and I'll be out by morning." Malone motioned to her officers, who began cuffing Hathaway and his remaining men. "We'll see about that." As the room emptied of Hathaway's cronies, Malone turned to Jonathan and Emily. "Are you two all right?" Jonathan nodded. "We're fine. Thanks for getting here when you did." Malone's sharp gaze landed on the ledger in Emily's hands. "Is that what I think it is?" Emily stepped forward, trembling but determined. "It's all here. The transactions, the fake accounts, everything. Proves what Hathaway's been doing." Malone took the ledger, flipping through its pages with a growing look of satisfaction. "This is a gold mine. It's not just Hathaway, this implicates everyone involved. With this, we can dismantle their entire operation." Emily looked hopeful for the first time. "You'll be able to protect my father now, won't you?" Malone's expression softened. "Yes, we'll place him in protective custody. You too. Hathaway won't be able to touch either of you." Jonathan stepped forward, his voice firm. "What about the rest of Hathaway's network?" He said this goes deeper. Malone nodded grimly. "It does. But this ledger is the key. With this, we can start pulling the threads and bringing them down. It'll take time, but we'll get them." Later that evening, Jonathan and Emily sat in the back of a police car, watching as Hathaway was loaded into another vehicle. His eyes found theirs through the window, and his twisted smile sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "This isn't over," Hathaway mouthed silently. Jonathan shifted, placing himself between Emily and the man who had terrorized her. "He's just trying to scare you," he said softly. "He's done." Emily nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I hope so." The next day, Jonathan returned to his cabin. The past few days felt like a whirlwind, and for the first time he allowed himself to breathe. He sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his thoughts a jumble of relief and uncertainty. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, Emily stood there, a faint smile on her face. She held an envelope in her hands. "My father wanted me to give you this," she said, handing it to him. Jonathan hesitated, then opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and a check. The letter read, "Mr. Blake, your courage and kindness have saved my daughter and my family. There are no words to express my gratitude. Please accept this as a token of thanks, though I know it pales in comparison to what you've done for us. You'll always have a friend in me. Charles Whitmore." The check was for an amount so large Jonathan could hardly comprehend it. He stared at it, speechless. Emily smiled. "You deserve this, Jonathan. You gave me a chance to start over. Now it's your turn." Jonathan set the envelope aside, looking at Emily with a grateful smile. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. I know you'll be all right." She nodded, her eyes misty. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget what you did for me." As she left, Jonathan sat back down by the fire, the weight of the check in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope for his own future. But even as he looked forward, he couldn't shake the sense that Hathaway's ominous words were a shadow waiting to resurface. The days following Hathaway's arrest brought a sense of cautious relief. Emily had been moved to a secure location, and her father, Charles Whitmore, was under police protection. Detective Malone assured Jonathan that the ledger's information would be the downfall of Hathaway's criminal empire. But Jonathan couldn't shake the unease lingering in the back of his mind. Hathaway's parting words haunted him. "This isn't over." One chilly morning, Jonathan stepped outside his cabin to find a black car parked at the edge of the woods. Its windows were tinted, and the engine idled, puffing small clouds of exhaust into the crisp air. Jonathan's chest tightened. He hadn't seen this car before, but its presence felt deliberate. He grabbed his axe and approached cautiously. As he neared, the driver's side window rolled down, revealing a man in a sharp suit and dark sunglasses. His expression was unreadable. "Mr. Blake," the man said, his voice calm yet chilling. "I'm here to deliver a message." Jonathan stopped several feet away, his axe resting across his shoulder. "What kind of message?" The man's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Mr. Hathaway may be out of the picture for now, but his associates are still very much in play. They don't appreciate loose ends." Jonathan's grip on the axe tightened. "Is that a threat?" The man's smile didn't waver. "It's advice. You and Ms. Whitmore would do well to leave this alone. Forget about the ledger, forget about the investigation, and move on with your lives. Otherwise," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Jonathan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You tell whoever sent you that I'm not afraid of cowards who hide behind suits and tinted windows." The man's smile faltered for the briefest moment before he nodded. "Suit yourself, Mr. Blake. But don't say you weren't warned." The window rolled up, and the car pulled away, disappearing down the dirt road. Jonathan stood there, his heart pounding. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That evening, Jonathan called Detective Malone. "They sent someone to my cabin," he said, recounting the encounter. Malone cursed under her breath. "We knew Hathaway's network would push back, but this confirms it. They're trying to intimidate you into silence." "It's not working," Jonathan said firmly. "But Emily needs to be warned. She's in a secure location," Malone assured him. "No one will get to her. But I'll have someone watch your cabin, just in case." Jonathan appreciated the offer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closer than Malone realized. If they'd found him, it was only a matter of time before they found Emily. The next day, Jonathan received an unexpected call. It was Emily. Her voice trembled with fear. "Jonathan, they found me," she said, barely above a whisper. "I saw a car outside the safe house. It's been parked there all day. I'm scared." Jonathan's stomach dropped. "Where's the police detail?" "They're still here, but I don't know. I feel like they're watching, waiting for the right moment." Jonathan clenched his jaw. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. I'll call Malone." "No," Emily said, her voice sharp with desperation. "If you call her, they might act faster. I don't know what to do." Jonathan hesitated, torn between following protocol and trusting his instincts. "All right, I'll come to you. We'll figure this out together. It was late when Jonathan reached the safe house, a modest suburban home on the outskirts of the city. The street was quiet, but he noticed a dark sedan parked a few houses away. Its engine wasn't running, but the figure inside made no attempt to hide their presence. Jonathan parked his truck a block away and approached on foot, moving silently through the shadows. As he neared the safe house, he spotted Emily watching from a second-story window. Her pale face relaxed slightly when she saw him. He entered through the back door, where one of the officers stationed inside greeted him. "Mr. Blake? What are you doing here?" "I'm here to make sure Emily's safe," Jonathan replied. "She called me." The officer frowned. "You shouldn't be here. This is a secure location." Before he could finish, the unmistakable sound of shattering glass rang out from the front of the house. Both men froze. "They're here," Jonathan said, grabbing a kitchen knife from the counter. The officer drew his weapon and gestured for Jonathan to stay back. But Jonathan followed anyway, his instincts screaming that Emily was still in danger. The front door burst open, and two masked men stormed in, weapons drawn. The officer fired a warning shot, and the intruders ducked behind the wall. "Drop your weapons," the officer commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. Instead of complying, one of the intruders opened fire, forcing the officer to dive for cover. Jonathan grabbed a heavy vase from a nearby table and hurled it at the second man, knocking him off balance. Before the man could recover, Jonathan tackled him, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. "Emily, get upstairs and lock yourself in," Jonathan shouted as the struggle continued. The officer managed to disarm the first attacker, but the second one broke free from Jonathan's grasp and bolted toward the stairs. Jonathan grabbed a fallen chair and swung it, catching the man across the back and sending him sprawling to the floor. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air. The intruders, realizing they were out of time, abandoned their assault and fled through the shattered front door. The officer, blood trickling from a graze on his arm, stayed behind to check on Emily. Jonathan followed him upstairs, where they found Emily trembling but unharmed. She threw her arms around Jonathan, tears streaming down her face. "They're not going to stop," she whispered. "They won't stop until we're both gone." Jonathan held her close, his own resolve hardening. "Then we don't stop either. We'll take this all the way." Hours later, as the safe house was secured and Emily was moved to a new location, Jonathan met with Malone again. "They're getting desperate," Malone said, her tone grim. "The closer we get to dismantling Hathaway's network, the more dangerous they'll become." Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. "We have to finish this. No more waiting. No more hiding." Malone studied him for a moment before nodding. "Agreed. I'll need your help, though. If we're going to take them down, we'll need to draw them out. And you might be the only one they'll come for." Jonathan's gaze darkened. "Whatever it takes. Let's end this." The cold air bit at Jonathan's skin as he stepped out of his truck, parked on a secluded stretch of highway outside the city. He'd agreed to Detective Malone's plan, knowing it was the only way to draw Hathaway's associates into the open. Now, in the dead of night, the stage was set for the confrontation that would either bring an end to the nightmare or cost him everything. Emily, still shaken from the attack at the safe house, had been moved to a heavily guarded facility. Jonathan had insisted she stay there, far away from the danger. But even as he prepared to face Hathaway's network, her words echoed in his mind. "They won't stop until we're both gone." He adjusted the comms earpiece Malone had given him. "I'm in position," he said quietly. Malone's voice crackled in his ear. "Copy that. Stay visible but keep your weapon concealed. We'll move in as soon as they show themselves." Jonathan nodded, though the detective couldn't see him. He stood by his truck, his axe hidden behind the seat, and waited. The headlights appeared first, cutting through the darkness as 3 black SUVs approached. They stopped about 30 feet away, and several men stepped out. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces shadowed, but their intentions were clear. One of them stepped forward, his posture commanding. Jonathan recognized him immediately. It was the man who had visited his cabin days earlier. "Mr. Blake," the man called out, his voice carrying easily in the stillness. "You've been causing quite a bit of trouble. It's time to settle this." Jonathan didn't move. "If you're here for the ledger, you're wasting your time. It's already with the police." The man chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Oh, we're well aware. That's why we're here. For you." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "You've interfered enough," the man continued. "And unfortunately, that means you've outlived your usefulness." The sound of car doors slamming echoed as more men stepped out of the SUVs, each one armed. They fanned out, surrounding Jonathan with practiced precision. "Do you really think this is going to end well for you?" the man asked, his tone almost pitying. Jonathan's voice was calm but firm. "No, but it's not going to end well for you either." The man raised an eyebrow, confused, just as the first floodlight illuminated the area. Shouts erupted as police vehicles roared onto the scene, blocking the SUVs from retreating. Officers poured out, their weapons trained on the men. "Drop your weapons. Hands in the air." Malone's voice rang out, commanding and unyielding. The men hesitated for a moment before one of them fired a shot. Chaos erupted as the police returned fire, scattering the assailants. Jonathan ducked behind his truck, grabbing his axe as bullets ricocheted off the metal. The firefight was brief but intense. One by one, the attackers were subdued or fled into the woods. Jonathan spotted the leader trying to retreat and moved quickly, intercepting him before he could escape. The man swung a pistol toward Jonathan, but Jonathan was faster. He brought the blunt side of the axe down on the man's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. The man snarled in pain, lunging at Jonathan with surprising ferocity. The two grappled, their struggle lit by the flashing lights of police vehicles. The man landed a blow to Jonathan's ribs, but Jonathan countered, driving the handle of the axe into the man's stomach. The leader fell to his knees, gasping for air. "It's over," Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The man looked up, his expression twisted with rage. "You have no idea what you've done. There are more of us. You can't stop it." Jonathan stepped back as Malone and two officers approached, their guns trained on the man. She gestured for her team to cuff him and read him his rights. "We'll see about that," Malone said, her tone cold. By dawn, the scene was under control. Most of Hathaway's men had been arrested, and those who fled were being hunted. The leader, now handcuffed and sitting in the back of a squad car, glared at Jonathan as he was driven away. Malone approached, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "That was risky, but it worked. We've got the people behind Hathaway, and with the ledger, we'll be able to dismantle their entire operation." Jonathan nodded, leaning against his truck. "And Emily? She's safe." Malone smiled faintly. "She's safe. And now, she doesn't have to keep looking over her shoulder." Jonathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. "Good. That's all that matters." A week later, Jonathan sat outside his cabin, the autumn air crisp and quiet. He had received word that Charles Whitmore had been reunited with Emily under police protection. The investigation was ongoing, but the worst was over. As he stared out at the forest, a car pulled up the dirt road. Emily stepped out, her face lighting up when she saw him. "I had to come thank you," she said, walking up to him. "For everything." Jonathan smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, Emily." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "You saved my life. Twice. And you didn't have to." Jonathan hesitated, then nodded. "I'm just glad you're safe. That's all I wanted." Emily reached into her bag and handed him a small envelope. "It's not much, but my father wanted you to have this." Inside was another note. This one simple but heartfelt. "You're a hero, Jonathan. Thank you for saving my family." Attached was a deed to a plot of land near the forest, a place Jonathan had long dreamed of expanding his work. Jonathan looked up, his throat tight with emotion. "This is too much." Emily shook her head, smiling. "It's not enough, but it's the least we could do." As she drove away, Jonathan sat on the porch, holding the deed in his hands. The quiet of the forest wrapped around him, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. Hathaway's network was crumbling. Emily and her father were free, and though the scars of the past few weeks would take time to heal, Jonathan knew one thing for certain. They had won.